Hey, this is Jeremy from Production Den. So glad to have you with me on the channel today. Today we're going to be talking about how you set up and prep for a mix for your song. So right now I'm actually working on mixing down a whole bunch of tracks for an album project. And I wanted to share with you the process that I use every time that I get ready to go into a mix. I don't know about you all, but when I'm in recording and arranging mode, everything can get really messy inside of the DAW to where you have clips everywhere, they're all different colors and they're in all different places and you're not quite sure what's what anymore. So I'm gonna walk you guys through the couple of things that I do every time that I'm getting ready to move into a mixing phase of a song. So let's jump in. I'm a very visual person, so I like to use a very consistent color pattern in all of my projects so that when I open it up, I can tell immediately what's in the project and I know exactly what I need to do or where I need to go to work on a specific set of instruments or effects or anything else along those lines. So one of the first things that I like to do is go in and actually name the track. So drums, and then coloring it. I usually pick gray for my drums. And then I will group the track above by right-clicking and say group with above track. And I do that for several of those tracks so that I'm lining everything up that's drums underneath of one kind of folder for our drums. And then you'll notice I do the same thing for electric. So I'll right-click on that, rename and change it, and then I'll change the color by clicking on that little swatch to the right, and then picking a color that I choose for electric. And then doing the same basic process of grouping some of the other tracks with that as well. And group with the above track. Doing that so that I have a folder of all of my electric guitar parts. And you'll notice that I select a whole bunch of the electric tracks by holding down Control and right-clicking around. And that selects them, and then I hold Shift and I press up and down, and that will move the tracks. And then the next thing that I do is I'll actually click on the little small icon on each one of the electric tracks and then go down to the change color. And then I'll change that to the same color that the grouping or the folder is at as well, so they'll all be that same color so that at a glance I can see everything that's electric has that same blue color to it, or whatever tone that I pick for the instrument that I'm working on. So you'll see, as I go down and look through each one of the audio files, I'm using a tool. I use the Y tool, which is the preview tool. So you can click on that, a speaker will show up, and if you left click on an audio file, it will play the sound of that audio file. And so I'll go through and check all the vocals to see which ones were the lead vocals and which ones were the background vocals. And then I'll separate those out in the same way that I did earlier by color coding those, putting them together in basic folders in the playlist, and then moving on and doing the same thing with the background vocals as well. And then once I've gotten everything squared away, there's usually a couple different tracks that I need to delete out because there's too much space between. So I'll right click on that and then select delete. And that will say okay. Do that a couple of times to even things out. Or if I need to put a track in, I'll do the same thing. I'll right click on that right side and then I'll say insert one. And that will give me a little bit of spacing. And I like to space out each group of the instruments so I have at least one track in between so that I know where each of those sections starts. And that just helps me keep things a little bit more organized as well. So one of the things that I noticed is when I was going through, there was a lot of clips that weren't color coded that were part of the playlist, which means that there were some extra clips that I ended up not using in the playlist. So one of the things that I do is I go up to the tools, and there's actually a macro, and it says basically purge all the unused audio clips. And that will get rid of all those audio clips that weren't colored or weren't part of the final track that was put together. And then what I start doing is actually moving things around in the channel rack. So I will highlight one by left clicking on it so that box is highlighted, and then I will use the Alt and up arrows to move them around. So I'm grouping similar colors together so they're all color coded together in the same spot. So all the lead vocals, all the background vocals, all the electrics and bass and all those things. And I try to do the same thing as in the playlist, so I'll have them ordered the same way that I have them in the playlist to keep things visually organized as well. So this next part, I'm actually going to go through all of the bass files, and I'm listening through for the different bass types, and then I'm going to group those together. So I had a Rickenbacker bass, so like a regular bass sound in this project, as well as a synth bass, which was like a Reese bass. So I ended up creating a couple more bass tracks by inserting those in, and then color coding them the same golden color for the bass. And then I just separated them out between the Reese bass versions and the Rickenbacker bass versions. And then I'm going to be setting up to actually render those tracks out. And then I'm going to select along the playlist. So I'll right click and drag around the section that I'm getting ready to render for one of those instruments. And then I'll right click on the red dot, or the dot that's down at the bottom of the track, and then name it what I'm going to render it. So I think I named this one the Reese bass, which was for the last half of the section that I was selecting. And then say save, and then I will press Alt and R, and that will bring up the render, and I'm gonna render that particular selection. And so that renders out the track. And then I went ahead and did the same thing with the Rickenbacker bass part. I selected along the playlist top, the section that I'm getting ready to render just for the bass part, and I'll go through and do the same thing. So I'll go into the mixer track, right click on the little record button at the bottom of the mixer track, name it to be, I think I called it Rickenbacker bass in this instance, and then I rendered that out by pressing the Alt R and then choosing the selection of the song and moving forward from there. So then you'll notice that I have two audio files that are actually part of the project now. One is the rendered Rickenbacker bass, and then the other is the rendered Reese bass. So what that I'll end up doing is muting out all the MIDI clips that I rendered into audio files, and then I'll collapse down those tracks. Collapse them down by just double clicking on the bottom section of it, and it'll make it a smaller version. And then I went to the track where the bass was rendered, the audio file, and I selected that, turned that to the Rickenbacker bass, and then, or just bass, and then color coded that for the same yellow color, and then did the same thing with the Reese bass. And then up at the top, after I rendered out the drums into each individual track, I ended up deleting out all of the drums that were just MIDI components of that. And once that's done, I set up so that I can start putting everything into the mixer. So you'll see me select all of the drum clips by left clicking and dragging on all of the drum audio files. And then I go into the mix by pressing F9. I selected the first track, and then I press Control, Shift, and L, and that will map in all those drums side by side. And then I just went through and named each individual mixer track. So I had the kick, and then the snare, then the hi-hat, and then other percussion. The next things you'll see me do is actually select all of the background vocal channels together. So I pressed down Alt and Shift and selected and dragged, and then did the same thing for the overshoot of those tracks. And then I right-clicked on that bottom knob and selected to only go to one track. So everything is pushed to one individual track. And that track becomes the bus track for the background vocals. So I call it BGV bus, and then I will usually color a little bit lighter than the color that I've selected for that group. And then I'll put a little symbol that shows multiple things going into one so that I know that it's a bus track. And sometimes you'll need to select multiple tracks that are empty. And so you'll see me go in the mixer and select a couple different tracks by pressing that Control and Shift. And then I press Alt and left arrow to move those over where I actually needed them in the mixer track. And then you'll see me do the same kind of thing where I select all the drums and then I route them to only one track, which is going to be the bus track for that group of instruments. And then I'll name it accordingly with a little bit of a lighter color and a different name, and same symbol that shows that multiple tracks goes into one. So that becomes the bus for the drums. And then I'll do the same thing usually for bass and other instruments. So you'll see me going through and grouping all the electrics together, pushing them closer together, and then creating a bus for them as well. And then usually after I've set up all of the bus tracks, I will bus those to one track, which will be the mix bus. So I'll bus all of the electric bus, the drum bus, the bass bus, and the vocal buses all to this one mix bus before it goes to the master track. And again, that's done by selecting each one of those individual things and then saying route to this track only for the mix bus track. The mix bus track, dock it to the left side with the master track by right-clicking on it and then going down to the option that says dock to, and then I'll say dock to left, and that will put it on the left side of the mixer track with the master track, and that way everything is flowing into that as well. Well, hopefully that was helpful for you to be able to see the process that I use every time before I start a mix on a song. If you have any comments or questions about what I'm doing or suggestions for improvement to the workflow, please leave those in the comment section below, and I will see you in the next round.